There are three basic types of mixtures, and you need to be aware of the ones that are present in the human body. So the first one is what's called a solution. And in this case, the solute particles are what's the smaller amount. So these are the solute particles. So let's say that this is a sodium solution. The sodium and the chloride would be the solute particles. The solvent is always what is the greater amount, and the universal solvent is water. So a solution is made up of two things. It's made up of a solute, which could be salt, it could be glucose, could be many, many things, and a solvent, which is most likely going to be water. And in the body, water is the universal solvent. The example that they're using here is mineral water, and whatever mineral is in the water would be the solute. The next example is what's called a colloid. And in a colloid, the solute particles are a little larger. They're larger than in the solution and they scatter light, but they do not settle out. So that's a really important difference that you need to know. The example that they're showing here would be Jello. Another example, though, that's actually in the cell of the human body would be cytoplasm, because the solute would represent whatever particles are within the cytoplasm. So this is the organelle, the the solvent would be the cytosol, which is mostly water. So together they make up a colloid. So in this case, the organelles act as the solute and they're larger, so they scatter light, but they do not settle out when mixed. The third type of example is a suspension, and these solute particles are very large. They settle out and they may also scatter light. So here they're a lot larger, and the best example in the body is that of red blood cells. So here, when blood is taken, it's put into a test tube and it's spun down in a centrifuge. And when that happens, the more dense particles, which are the solutes, are the red blood cells, white blood cells, and the platelets. So they settle to the bottom. The plasma then is what's going to be at the top of the test tube because it's the least dense. So that's the third example of a mixture. So we're going to talk next about chemical bonds. And chemical bonds are energy relationships between electrons. So remember, the only important subatomic particle for bonds are electrons. So they're the subatomic particles involved in the chemical reaction. And most specifically, we're going to be referring to the outermost electrons in what's called the valence shell, which we'll be talking about coming up. So on this next slide, this talks about the role of electrons in chemical bonding. As we saw from that cloud model, the electrons occupy an area around the nucleus, and that is specifically in what are called electron shells. If you want, you can think of electron shells like an orbit of a planet. So since Mercury is our first planet, that would be the first electron shell, and the sun would represent the nucleus. Each shell has a certain amount of electrons, and these represent an energy level. And those shells can hold a certain number of electrons. So the closest to the nucleus, and again, in this example, think of the nucleus as the sun as the example. The first orbit around the nucleus would be the first energy level. So here we have the nucleus. We're going to say this is lithium, and lithium has 3 protons and it has 4 neutrons. Remember, the neutrons do play a role as far as mass, but nothing to do with charge. And since it has 3 protons, it's going to have 3 electrons because remember, everything on the periodic table is electrically neutral. So there's going to be a max of 2 electrons on the first energy level, and the third electron would be on the second energy level, and it will look just like this. So the first shell can hold a max of 2 electrons, which I've drawn for you on the right here for lithium. Shell 2 can hold a maximum of 8 electrons. So this would involve a larger atom, which would be in the second row of the periodic table, but could be all the way to the right. Shell 3 kind of corresponds to the third row of the periodic table, but it can hold a maximum of 18 electrons. But the outermost electrons are what's most important. It's called the valence shell. And the reason this is important is because it's involved in chemical reactions. So in order for a bond to actually form, it has to meet what's called the octet rule, called the rule of eights. And atoms, in order for them to be stable, they desire 8 electrons in their valence shell. Now, some of the exceptions to that are smaller atoms like hydrogen and helium, because they only have a max of 2 electrons in shell 1. So hydrogen actually only has 1 valence electron, and helium has 2 valence electrons. So the desire to have 8 electrons is the driving force behind chemical reactions. One of those exceptions is what's called a noble gas. And if you've had chemistry, you've heard of noble gases before. They're on the far right side of the periodic table. So pause this video and take a look at your appendix in your ebook, and you'll see the periodic table. On the right side of the periodic table would be things like neon, for example, or helium. Those have a full octet. Helium is an exception to that, but everything below helium has a full octet. So noble gases have the full 8 valence electrons, or 2 for helium, which is that exception. Most atoms, though, do not have a full valence shell, which is why they either form ions if they're by themselves, or they bond with one another. So atoms will gain, lose, or share electrons to form bonds with one another to get to that magic number of 8. So we're going to see a few examples in this slide. These are chemically inert elements, which means they are unreactive. They're not going to react. So helium is that one exception of a noble gas. You can see that it has 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 electrons. Since the protons and electrons are equal, it's neutral. Neon, though, has 10 protons, 10 neutrons, and 10 electrons. Because again, it's neutral because they're protons and electrons. There's going to be 2 in the first shell and 8 in the second shell. And when you look at the periodic table and basically count the boxes up until you get to neon, that'll make sense. Some of the chemically reactive ones are one that do not meet a full valence. And you can see the outermost is the valence. We have 1 for hydrogen. We have 4 for carbon. We have 6 for oxygen. And we have 1 for sodium. Again, since they're all less than a full octet, that means that they're going to form they're either going to become an ion by themselves, or they're going to bond with each other. And on the next video, we're going to start talking about bonding.